Our first speaker, you've heard from him yesterday, but those of you who might not have heard of him yesterday, I'll reintroduce August. August Cole is an author and futurist, exploring the future of conflict through fiction and other forms of storytelling. He's non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council and works on creative foresight at Spark Cognition. He's also, which is an AI company, he's also co-author with Pete Singer of Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next world. I haven't actually read Ghost Fleet yet, because I haven't yet been given my free copy. August, over to you.
Thank you all for showing up, and Paul, we'll have to work on your library. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes let you in a little bit on how I think about the future of war, and not so much as to tell you what to think, but to explain a little bit about how I work and the ways that I've been using fiction and narrative storytelling to help people understand what's coming down the pike. This is a really important quote in the context of the conversation in this conference. The character of war, of course, is changing. How fundamental, though, to use the Clausewitzian framework. What we're talking about here, of course, is one of the most fundamental human experiences, sitting in traffic. And that, of course, is something that we're probably going to be persistently dealing with for a variety of reasons, whether we have flying cars, whether we have ones with four wheels. That continuity is its own expression, I think, of this very question of what is ahead with not only our daily lives, but also conflict itself. When I was at the Atlantic Council last year, we went up to the High North in Norway to go to Kirkenes to see the Russian border, a typical kind of a fact-finding type visit. And part of the context, again, was understanding, from my perspective, what we call hybrid warfare look like in the High North. Because this is a kind of conflict, of course, that is much more, I would say, creative and opportunistic than traditional military campaigns. And so the way that I, therefore, decided to go about thinking about it was to write a short story, which was a way to synthesize, in many cases, some of the different inputs that are out there. If you step back and think, we're now reconsidering Europe as a domain in which conflict, whether it's low intensity or high intensity, is possible. The US, of course, has pivoted to Asia and went through a few years of trying to come around from being in a counterinsurgency and counterterrorism focus to great power nation-state conflict with China. And now we're re-examining what Europe might hold. Now, this is a picture in Australia. It's actually a C-17 that the Royal Australian Air Force flew at low altitude. I believe it was through Adelaide. Kind of blew people's minds because it's a big, ugly jet flying really fast and low. But it speaks to the kind of imagery and kind of recalibration that we just aren't used to anymore of seeing, military operations in dense urban areas, things like that are part of the narrative shift that is occurring right now as well. A lot of the talks that I do give, of course, have pictures of planes and tanks and all kinds of futuristic stuff, which you'll see over the next few minutes. But this is actually what the future of war looks like. This is the Gartner hype cycle curve, which is impossible to read from the back of the room. You should Google it. What is important is that it speaks to the way that we are understanding the onrush of certain technologies out there. Augmented reality is sort of pushed, as you can see, to the right and low there on the expectations chain. But if you think about the boom and bust that we see in our technology sectors, right up there at the peak, you've got AI, you've got a bit of bio, the sorts of technologies that tend to end up on the front pages of magazines and on TV when people are talking about what's ahead. Any one distinct technology here is potentially revolutionary, smart fabrics, for example. But in totality, when you holistically look at all of them together, that is a more realistic expression of the future. But it's really hard analytically to bundle all that together into one consumable form of content, whether it's a white paper or some other kind of report. And so what tools do we have? I've been writing fiction since I chucked journalism about 9 years ago to try to get ahead of what was coming down the road. The journalism is a wonderful field, and I still love writing in that domain, but it's very hard to write about what's going to happen. It's necessarily a retrospective kind of accounting of the moment, and more so today when it's minute by minute. So I've been working in fiction and trying to use the sorts of stories, whether it's a novel like Ghost Fleet or short pieces like Angry Trident, which I wrote about the High North. I've really kind of struggled to often articulate, though, what it is. And of course, being a former resident of Washington, D.C., and someone who's on the periphery of the national security community, I came up with an acronym because an acronym is often one of the best ways to communicate directly with someone. And I came up with FICINT, which is in many ways in the description that the U.S. intelligence community uses when they're talking about intelligence. There's IMINT, which is Imagery Intelligence. And I see the sorts of fiction that is out there that has this kind of insights into the future of conflict that you might call it fictional intelligence. Again, being a good acronym, it has these elements within it. Foresight, of course, is a really important piece of that. That's the more traditional sort of expression of vignettes and often characterless descriptions, but still forward-looking, a couple paragraph snapshots of what might be coming down the pike. But the nuance piece of it is important, of course, because the gray areas are really what are some of the best stories and actually most honestly reflect the future. Technology in and of itself is going to be surprising in ways that we don't expect. And it's often hard to write about what you don't know, but if you go back to that Gardner hype cycle picture, I think what you can see is that by fusing some of those elements together, by thinking about those traffic jams, so to speak, you can come up with a fairly accurate picture. And we are at a really interesting moment, at least in the US community, I think with some of the allied nations like UK and Australia as well, where this approach is getting traction. What's really interesting to see is that it is both a bottom-up movement that is linked with the recognition in professional military development that writing is a crucial skill for sharing ideas, for learning, for developing community. And now you're seeing from the bottom up a wonderful crop of writers experimenting with short fiction for the first time. That's one of my favorite emails I get. Hey, I just wrote a short story. Do you mind taking a look at it? Those sorts of inputs are really, really valuable because they're fusing the operational experience that many of our service members have had over the last 2 decades with their thinking and analysis and lessons learned about what will be coming down the pike. And then there's a top-down aspect too. This is a Marine Corps publication that was a series of 3 short stories that was designed to be an annex to their traditional foresight document that not very many people read. It's very good. It has original and synthetic thinking in it, synthesized thinking. But they knew that if they wanted to reach the whole force, they would have to be more creative. And so we at the Atlantic Council, with a couple other writers, including Max Brooks, who wrote World War Z, we worked with them to help develop these. And the writing was all done by the Marines who were brought in for a workshop to do that. And I think what you really see within that is the perspective shift that occurs, not just for the writer, but for the audience. This is a propaganda poster that we made for our Go Sleep promotional campaign a few years ago, imagining how the US might respond to a very critical question in great power conflict in the Pacific is, what do we do about our long, long supply chain that we, of course, rely on in mainland China? The idea that you might see a poster like this outside an elementary school, having kids drop off toys to be recycled for rare metals or other parts, doesn't seem that far-fetched. And when you can use visual artifacts like this, other techniques that are effective are writing fake news stories, creating news stories and updates from the future. When you can give someone something tangible like that, it allows them, I think, to further get outside their perspective and the sorts of patterns of thinking that often keep us from really seeing the future clearly. Because this human element is really important. This is Theodore. He's like one of the saddest people you've ever seen because his operating system just dumped him. Essentially, it's from the Spike Jonze film called Her in 2013, which I would highly recommend. It's ultimately about the relationship between human and algorithm. And I think that has immense importance for the future of conflict. What if, for example, the most charismatic small unit leader was an OS? This is an expression of that in that other very elemental human experience, love. There's a lot we don't know, though, about what's coming down the pike. This, I think, is a really good visual reminder. It's art produced by Google's Deep Dream engine. I have no idea what it is. It disturbs me, and that's why I want to show it to you, because it is effective at communicating how many of these big existential questions that we as humans try to answer about our own world, like what is art? What is beauty? Has a machine analog to it now that we're just yet starting to comprehend. So to bring this back to that border region that Norway shares with Russia, one of the ways that I tried to, again, synthesize a lot of these elements in a near future context was to write a short story. The way you pitch ideas, like in Hollywood, is you need to have a snappy 2 or 3 sentence or 1 sentence, pitch kind of line. And so mine was Band of Brothers, which is a U.S. Series based off the Stephen Ambrose book. Band of Brothers in the Arctic meet with warbots, right? The idea being that you're really trying to catch someone's attention with a narrative that would explore the practical realities, much like Ghost Fleet did in the Pacific, to understand what it might be like in the high north. And so the story just essentially follows a Marine and a Norwegian soldier as they look at not just a military operation, but a large humanitarian crisis caused by a nuclear incident across the border in Russia, where thousands of people are coming across into the Kirkenes region. And that's inspired in part by the movement of refugees from Russia into that area a few years ago that caused a lot of consternation for officials up there. And it started to change the patterns on the ground. Imagine if that was scaled up dramatically in a very opportunistic and creative way. Again, the hallmarks of the kinds of conflict that we're going to see more of that are below the threshold of being kinetic, but it can have decades-long strategic impact. So as a writer, I'm always thinking about things like that from that adversary point of view. What would I do if I was the bad guy? And I think that's an extremely important perspective to try on. You know, red teams obviously do that in a fairly prescribed way. War games do too, that militaries and private sector organizations run. One of the challenges with that, though, is often those are used to justify existing programs, make the boss look good. They don't actually disrupt the thinking that may be in the consensus. You know, some of the lessons learned that I pulled out of that story in writing and discussing with people afterwards were the way that hybrid warfare will express itself in the north, the high north particularly, will be different than it is down in the Black Sea region. That there is not necessarily a template, that calling it a sort of canonical or almost really rigid framework, I think doesn't do service to the kinds of adversaries that are out there in the world today. The distribution of assets that NATO nations have is going to be incredibly important. Interoperability is obviously a key to that, but in this era of persistent surveillance and ubiquitous information, which is only going to increase, if you can see it, you can destroy it. So any time you centralize aircraft at one airfield, you have armor altogether, there's a very good chance it will be lost quickly. One of my favorite parts about Ghost Fleet, which often gets talked about as a high-tech novel, is actually the low-tech aspects of that book. What do you do when you don't have connectivity? When you can't call back for help? What sort of innovations and on-the-fly adjustments can you make to tactics and even to strategy based on the assumption that you won't have the connectivity we often really take for granted? And the last are the key capabilities here at the bottom. Those are some of the elements that, of course, you saw tested at Trident Juncture, and I think you're going to have, particularly with autonomous weapons systems, there may be some reframing about what it means to be a first mover or second mover, to use that concept from the tech business, and that those nations that are slow to adopt obviously have a risk that they run in not having the operational experience and data gathering that is important with high-tech systems. At the same time, they may be able to wield more moral authority and letting the exigencies of conflict carry them towards a more probably realistic expression of what war will be like in the future. I'll kind of wrap up quickly just to say that this is a time when the failure of imagination, of course, is a very real risk. This is the Maginot Line, which I think is a perfect expression of how militaries can come to a conclusion that they have done the right strategic thinking and come up with an expression of it, and it's completely off for how warfare changed. I would encourage you all to read widely, too. I don't read Chinese, but Liu Cixin, for example, is one of my favorite science fiction writers. This book is actually about the development of weapons. It was written 10, 12 years ago and just now translated into English. It's a fascinating prequel, if you will, to a series he wrote about first contact with aliens called Three-Body Problem, which is also very important in thinking about the future of war. And I'll leave you with a quote here from Martin Dempsey, who is both a great advocate, one of those top-down experts that I talked about, who really believes in the power of writing, but he's also really been outspoken about the value of science fiction. This appears in a volume that I participated in called Strategy Strikes Back, about how to use Star Wars to think about future of conflict and military strategy. And that's the sort of perspective I think that we're starting to see out there. And the more we can break out of these kind of confines, I think the more prepared we'll be in trying to understand what's coming down the pike with the future of conflict. Thank you.
August, thank you very much indeed. What a great and challenging presentation. I think it's a bit of a cliche in a way, isn't it? How many we all say, I think we see not what you just said as a cliche, but we come across so many movies that sort of sink deep, Die Hard 4 even, things of that sort. And then we and we'll wait a couple of years, then we say, oh, that was what we thought, what we thought we glimpsed in the movie, and so on. So it's as if these fictional stories, these imaginings, somehow are almost as much a work of the imagination as they are a kind of anticipated documentary on the way the world will be, and too often they turn out to be quite truthful. So I suppose the question I would have is, we were talking about responsibility a couple of minutes ago. What responsibility does Ficint have for getting it right or not getting it wrong or whatever? So there's an interesting question to discuss there, I guess.